I'm Hunter Atkins, Chairman of the Bank of Nashville. Today's CEO Cafe features Jon Meacham. John's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and his latest book is Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. We use the CEO Cafe Forum to show the people of Nashville, and especially the executives of Nashville, what leadership is about and the challenges and the opportunities therein. Thomas Jefferson was a great thinker, but also was a great doer. And I think from the lessons today of Jon Meacham, you'll see how it's applicable to the daily leadership styles of the people within our community. Thank you on behalf of the Bank of Nashville.
Jon Meacham, as you probably know by now, is the author of Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. This book went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and was listed by the New York Times Book Review, Washington Post, and a host of publications throughout the country as one of the top books of the year. I had the privilege of hearing Jon speak a few months ago at the Downtown Public Library with 400 or 500 other Nashvillians on a cold, wet, wintry night, and I think it's safe to say no one left disappointed at all. So I can with confidence say you've got a real treat in store this morning. Jon's view of Jefferson is not just a history lesson, it's a case study in executive leadership and management from one of our most effective founding fathers. And he'll be telling you about a 1-2 punch that worked effectively for Jefferson that's just as relevant today. If you'll listen for it, you may want to go back to your office and see how you're doing with them. Jon is the managing editor of Random House, has been a contributing editor to Time, has been executive editor of Newsweek magazine, and is a frequent contributing guest on national television programs where you may have seen him on Meet the Press and Morning Joe. The history of Jon personally is he's a Chattanooga boy, graduate of Macaulay, graduate of Sewanee, University of the South. At the end of Jon's presentation, there'll be time for a Q&A period. Don't feel like you didn't speak up loud enough when he repeats your question. We've asked him to do that because there's there'll only be one live mic in the room, and that'll be his, and we'll want our television audience to hear the question as well as the answer. We're proud and pleased to note that Jon now is a neighbor, a resident of Nashville with his wife and 3 children. So welcome our speaker this morning and our new neighbor, Jon Meacham.
Delighted to be here. Thank you. The Starbucks seating is particularly nice. And I want to talk about Jefferson. There are a couple of quick Tennessee points to make. Jim was kind enough to mention that I went to Sewanee. There may be a few of you who are not intimately familiar with the University of the South. If you are not, the best way to think of it is a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance. And so you conjure with that for a while, and you get, essentially, the University of the South. I was in Chattanooga last night, actually, and having a good time. And you do worry about when people will come up to you in a book line and say, "I remember when you threw up on me." And those were people I knew in college. So it's a little disturbing. But excited to talk about Jefferson, talk about the art of power. One of the reasons I did the book was I thought that Jefferson had become caricatured in one of 2 ways. One was either as an unrepentant slave owner, and therefore someone who was being dismissed really from the national conversation because of his views on race and slavery. And the other was as the kind of the airy philosopher of Monticello. The idea that he was sitting on top of the mountain, thinking big thoughts, dealing with wine, drawing new architectural schemes, writing beautiful sentences. But in point of fact, for 40 years, a biblical 40 years, he was almost constantly in the political arena. From 1769 until 1809, he was more or less constantly in public office. And the great dirty little secret of Jefferson's life is that he loved it. He couldn't help it. No president ever spoke better in needlepoint pillow terms than Thomas Jefferson, eminently quotable on all things. I love books, I love Monticello, I love if only I could get home to be with my family and my farm. Well, the road was open. You know, he could have gone back at any point, but on the few occasions when he did go back, he was rapidly trying to plan a return to the arena. So he had a certain fire inside him, a certain kind of consuming ambition that made him want to be part of what Justice Holmes would later call the passion and action of his times. And so the mystery to me of Jefferson, and the reason it was worth spending 4 years with him, when you're a biographer, it's okay to talk to your subject. It's when they start talking back that you get in trouble. It turns into Jack Nicholson and The Shining, and things get really unattractive. Is trying to figure out what was the tension between the life of the mind and his political life, and the extraordinarily contradictory impulses within him. Obviously, the author of the Declaration of Independence never freed his slaves. The ferocious advocate of small government and strict construction was a power-grabbing, wide power executive. He was against executive power until he was for it, to quote our Secretary of State. The thing about him that I found ultimately rewarding and convincing in an argument about what made him tick is that he was human. And he was a politician raised in an era in which elective office, appointive office, was the expected métier of someone like him. He was expected to serve. He was expected to command. There was no other real path for him in many ways. He could have retired to his farm. Some people did. But that would have made him the exception, not the rule. But what made him, though he went into this ethos, what made him into the most successful political figure of the early republic, and arguably, I would say, the most successful, politically successful president in American history, measured by the raw standard you can think of, which is the gathering and holding of power. He had the 40 years in office, and then from 1800 till 1840, for 36 of those years, either Thomas Jefferson himself or a self-described Jeffersonian was president of the United States. No one else has done that. Lincoln didn't do it, despite Daniel Day-Lewis's best efforts. If you are a president, by the way, you want Daniel Day-Lewis to play you. That's a new rule. I don't see I don't see him playing Nixon, but you know, you never know. He created a dynasty that Lincoln didn't do, FDR didn't do, Reagan hasn't done. The one person who might is President Clinton. It is conceivable, now that we're in the 20th year of a politics largely dominated by centrist to center-left Democrats, that you could see this continuing, particularly if someone else named Clinton actually becomes president. Not that that's at all on the table. Some colleagues, journalistic colleagues of mine and I, we have basically what we call the political suicide pact. We will retire when George P. Bush and Chelsea Clinton run against each other for president. We decided that will be it. We cannot continue with the Wars of the Roses anymore. And so Howard Feynman and I are ready to jump off the plane together. So Clinton could do it, but no one else has. And so what was it? What was it about Jefferson that gave him this personal magnetism and political durability. I think it was three things. And just want to talk about them quickly. I do think, as Jim said, I think they are applicable in a broad sense to all of our lives and both our professional sense and certainly in our political sense going forward. I think that the greatest presidents have all worked in a kind of Jeffersonian model. It is very hard to think of another great president who did not combine a capacity to articulate the ideal in a brilliant and memorable way with the skill sets of a legislative mechanic, the tactical, tactile skills to make that ideal come closer to reality. Here's a game for the rest of the afternoon. If you can think of someone else, someone who disproves that, let me know. But Lincoln could do it. No one spoke better, and no one traded horses more effectively than Lincoln. That was the great thing about the movie, I think, is it showed just what politics was. It's not all trumpets. It's who's going to be the postmaster of Akron is a central thing. FDR explicitly pointed back to the Jeffersonian example when he was trying to prepare the country for war with Britain. President Kennedy was a tough-minded politician. President Reagan, who is often seen now, I think, as this kind of ideologically pure, monumental figure, was in fact a labor negotiator. That was his most significant life experience before he became president, he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. And he used to say, people think Gorbachev is tough. They never met Jack Warner. So what Reagan knew was that you asked for 100% and you settled for 50. And so the drama of the 1980s becomes, in 1981, a week after President Reagan takes office, he says that the Soviet Union reserves unto itself the right to lie, to cheat, and to steal. In 1983, he goes to Orlando and calls it an evil empire to a National Association of Evangelicals meeting. Then by 1987, 88, he's literally in Red Square with Howard Baker playing with little Soviet babies. And it was a victory of negotiation and of brinksmanship in many ways, but he was always keeping his mind on the practical side of how to bring about the rhetorical result he wanted. He wanted that wall down, but just saying it didn't do it. You know, he had to give up some missiles, he had to deal with Gorbachev, and it worked. That's very Jeffersonian. Jefferson was a terrific negotiator. The problem is, in the political climate of that time, being a great negotiator was not something you wanted to talk about very much. You didn't even want to talk about being a politician. You had to be a kind of Cincinnatus figure, summoned from the farm to reluctantly hold power. I don't know, I suspect some of you all have occasionally had a conversation with someone who was thinking about running for office. I'm sure they never come to see you about anything involving fundraising or support, I guess is the way they talk about it. Have you ever met anyone who was thinking about running for office who did not formulate it this way? You know, some people have asked me to think about running. You know, my friends have come to me and said, what would you think about this? It's very rarely, you know, I'd really like to run. So the passive voice is a dead giveaway in that part of political culture. But Jefferson understood the practicalities of power. And he understood them largely because he had lived it his whole life. He was a student in Williamsburg at William and Mary. He studied the legislature. He had cousins and uncles who were all in power there. And he was able to master the ways and means of legislative bodies. He understood that if you knew the rules, you were best equipped to bend them. If you didn't know them, you couldn't operate as effectively. So he loved legislative detail. He hated giving speeches. He wasn't very good at it. His voice would drop. But, you know, in that climate, this isn't widely appreciated. This would be the largest audience that a public man would ever really address, because this is about the size of what the Congress would have been. It's actually probably a little larger. There were no public speeches, even in Jackson's time. I should say quickly, since we're here under the great good grace of a bank, that it's a good thing we're not talking about Jackson, given his essential view of bankers, which was not wildly positive. As you may remember, you know, Jackson once said that his only 2 regrets in public life were that he had not hung John C. Calhoun and shot Henry Clay, and Calhoun had been his vice president. Nobody else felt that way about their vice president until John McCain, actually. I figured I've got another year with that. It's great fun. I miss her, actually, a little bit. But, you know, whenever you can get a predicate before a subject, it's just a great thing. He understood that he had to find a way to operate where he was not trying to give a great speech. Didn't want to do it. Couldn't do it. So he did something that I think all of us should try to do. If the first great principle is be able to articulate a vision and have the mechanical skills to bring it into being. 2 skill sets that don't necessarily go together, right? We all know great tacticians, and lots of folks can paint a great picture of what one should do, set a great goal. Priests and prophets and intellectuals and professors are all very good at articulating the ideal. Being able to bring it into being is where political and institutional, organizational effectiveness and greatness really comes. Because if you can articulate and bring into being, then you've checked the 2 essential boxes. A lot of us are really good at one or the other. I think the truly exceptional leader, and I know historically that the truly exceptional presidents have been those who can do both. One of the ways Jefferson accomplished this is he did something that all of us, I think, in our lives in this season of Lent, which I'm sure everyone has been very disciplined and rigorous about, is my daughter, who's 8 years old, announced she was going to give up cussing for Lent. Well, now, wait a minute. You know, I don't think you can give up something you're not supposed to be doing in the first place. And I was afraid she was going to say, I'm going down to half a pack a day. You know, my hair was actually auburn until she was born. But that's a different topic. He managed, as we all should do, Jefferson managed to turn his vices into virtues, which is a remarkably important skill when you think about it. So he didn't like speaking, so he learned how to write quickly and well. He always wanted to be the guy who wrote the committee report. In this generation, I guess he would want to be the guy to prepare, God help us, the PowerPoint slides. Trying to put Jefferson in a PowerPoint context boggles the mind. But he believed that shaping that message, that being the guy at the keyboard, the man with the quill, gave him a measure of power and influence over the message and decision of a deliberative body that he couldn't get otherwise. Because then he would have, if he were the one writing the document, then everyone else would have to react to his voice and views. Remarkably interesting, I think, and intelligent insight into exercising power in a quiet way. Everything about Jefferson was about exercising power in a quiet way. When you go to Monticello, and I'm sure many of you have been there, remember his inventions are all about pushing a button over here and something happens over there. It's dumbwaiters. It's a trick to open the door where you can't see. It's the hidden application of power. Very subtle, very effective. He was shy. He could be seen as duplicitous. And so he took those vices and flipped it into a political virtue, again, by being a facile, communicative writer. Every great political leader, every great leader masters the means of communication of his age, right? So Jefferson was a great writer at a point when the written word was the central means of communication. Franklin Roosevelt mastered the radio. John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan mastered television. Barack Obama has self-evidently mastered the internet and digital expression. It's not really an elective prospect to be a great leader and be a good communicator. You know, you have to do it. There's no other way. Even if the communication, even if you're like George Washington, even if you're taciturn and somewhat distant, you are communicating that distance and that dignity at every point. And so as a leader, you all know this, you're always on stage. Every encounter you have with someone who works for you looms enormously larger to them than to you. So a passing word, a passing comment from you to someone who looks to you for leadership, who looks to you for management and direction, is going to stick with them for a long time. And you may not remember you ran into him on the way to the bathroom, but you did. Jefferson understood this. Jefferson understood that every passing comment mattered. And so it's an exhausting prospect. I think these are incredibly, one of the reasons I think presidents become so self-pitying so quickly, and they all do, is they realize that every time they talk, it's important and going to be remembered, whereas sometimes they just want to talk. And so finding that balance in your own lives is important. Presidents finding that balance is absolutely essential. President Obama has found it really by becoming more and more isolated. You know, he went off and played golf for 4 days with a couple of friends, which to my mind is one version of hell, but that's just because of my game is so bad. And they all end up doing that. President George W. Bush, have you all heard this, has become a painter. Eisenhower became a painter. Churchill became a painter, because it's actually something you can do alone and not have to deal with people all the time. It's a very, to my mind, it's an interesting relationship between how do you preserve your energy while you're in a post, a job, where you are required at every point to exert your will and your charm and your vision. So trying to find that balance is critical. Jefferson found it by turning every night to the thing he loved most, which was he did love books, he did love corresponding. His sense of letters and the importance of letters in the life of the country and in the public life was absolutely critical. I yield to no one in my editorial ego, but even I've never tried to rewrite the New Testament. Jefferson did. You know, he redid the Bible. So if we're worried about politicians overreaching now, just think about that the next time you're worried about it. So projecting a vision, having the technical skills, mastering the ways and means of legislative bodies, the ways and means of an organization was his first insight, and he was really the embodiment of that. He was better at it than Washington. He was better at it than Adams. And so he really was the first fully successful political leader in any sense that we would recognize. George Washington is an exception that proves all rules. You know, you can't really, I think, find as much accessibility as you can with Jefferson, with Washington, because he represents a kind of 18th century, really ancient world dignity, a kind of transcendent dignity that is just almost impossible to imagine in our own time, and was almost impossible then. You know, Abigail Adams said that the main reason George Washington was as powerful as he was is that he was the tallest guy in the room and the best horseman. And there was something to that. People were attracted to him and his reassurance. Jefferson was more like us, and you don't often think of that. He feels like a distant figure, someone who's beyond our kin. In point of fact, he was a man before he was a monument, and I think had a lot more in common with us than we might ordinarily think. So articulating the vision, making it happen, turning his vices into virtues, and finally, no one was better at departing from dogma when he needed to than Thomas Jefferson. The great example being the Louisiana Purchase, which comes to him, news of it on the 2nd of July, 3rd of July, 1803. Napoleon has been in his bathtub in Paris. I someday want to write a little essay about history that's been made in a bathtub. Napoleon's lying in the tub in cologne-scented water. Some of his hapless brothers come in. You know, he had all his brothers he had to find countries for, remember? And they come in looking for a country to govern. And he says, I renounce Louisiana. He wanted to get rid of the New World holdings, focus on Europe, focus on England. So he decides this terrible real estate deal for him, good for America. Word arrives on the 2nd or 3rd of July, 1803. It's wondrous. Jefferson immediately begins to draft a constitutional amendment giving him the power to buy Louisiana. Why? Because Jefferson's a strict construction guy, right? Constitution doesn't say double size of country when available. That was not something they put in there. He's fought Alexander Hamilton all these years over questions of power. As Jefferson himself put it, he and Hamilton fought like two cocks in a pit, constantly at each other's throats. And this was a very Hamiltonian thing to do, to buy Louisiana. So Jefferson wants to do it in a Jeffersonian way. He wants to go to the people, get permission. 6 weeks later, the 21st or 22nd of August, 1803, he gets a letter from Paris saying that Napoleon is rethinking this deal. In what I think of as Jefferson's Claude Rains moment, he is suddenly shocked that anyone would think we needed a constitutional amendment to buy Louisiana, throws all that out the window, buys it, and immediately expands the presidential office beyond anything anyone had contemplated. It was, in fact, in many ways, the beginning of the imperial presidency. Jefferson would have had no problem, by the way, ordering drone strikes on anybody, particularly Alexander Hamilton. But Aaron Burr took care of that. One of the things I try to point out is that for people who believe in Alexander Hamilton, and many people in the financial class are Hamiltonians, and understandably, but I like to point out that at least my guy didn't get shot in Jersey, whatever else. And I made that joke to Chris Christie recently. He didn't find it as funny as I did. And I don't want to cross him, since he's going to be running the world pretty soon. He compromised when he had to. He departed from dogma when he had to. And he understood that's what you had to do. He said, it is best to give as well as to take in a system such as ours. He said, the ground of liberty is gained by inches. He said that the duty of the chief magistrate is to the strict line of the law, but that is not the chief duty. The chief duty is the survival and success of the country. And so he had this remarkable elasticity. The one principle on which he would not compromise, ever, was the existence of the country. He and Adams really saw America in organic terms. I don't want to torture this metaphor, but he really saw it as a child that they had birthed, they had seen through its young days, its toddler days. They were trying to get it into its unruly adolescence. Again, we can go on forever with that. But it was a living thing to them. Their blood, the blood of their comrades, had sanctified it, and it was to them, the most important thing that had happened in the history of the world. Not only because they were involved in it, but because it was the first time, in a significant way, in the modern era, that anyone had attempted to codify the Enlightenment ideas that you and I should be in charge of our own destinies, that prelates and princes should not have absolute power to decide how we were going to live. Society, right before Jefferson came into public life, had gone from being vertical to horizontal in many ways. Power had come from above for century upon century upon century. It was being more diffuse, partly because of the Protestant Reformation, the translation of Scripture into the vernacular, the rise of Gutenberg, the spread of the bourgeoisie, the breaking down of feudalism, which Jefferson firmly believed in, even though he benefited from it in Virginia. Suddenly, power would not simply pass unchecked and unshared from authority to subject, but the subject should be trusted with the government of themselves. And that was the drama that was genuinely playing inside Jefferson's head. Yes, it was about raw power. Yes, it was about economics. Yes, it was about protecting slavery for Jefferson. But it was also about this idea that we, in fact, were the central players in life's drama. And that the American Revolution was the fullest embodiment and expression of that idea. And so he was going to do anything he could to preserve that experiment. And what it took, often, was a departure from previously held dogmatic positions. and he rarely hesitated to do that. Does that make him a hypocrite? Probably. To my mind, it simply makes him human. And I know in my life, I've already departed from dogma 6 times this morning. So I think that that too is a vice that is in fact a virtue. It just collapsed, didn't it? That was the ghost of Alexander Hamilton was pushing that down. Quickly, the Enlightenment idea, the American Revolution embodied the Enlightenment ideal in such an important way that Jefferson was going to fight for it as hard as he could. And if he had to do that in a very practical way, cut corners, change his mind, he would do it. Did it make him a hypocrite? Yes. But chiefly, I think the other important H word there is that he was human and that he was living life in the arena, trying to do the best he could through what George Eliot called the dim lights and tangled circumstance of the world. So I want to leave you with this. When you leave here and return to following the sequestration, my new favorite word, drama, and wonder how on earth politics could be so divided and awful, I want you to remember this. When Hamilton and Jefferson were fighting in the first years of the Republic, Washington tried to make peace between them. Washington didn't like the squabbling. And so he wrote a letter to both men in the first year of the full year of the administration, saying this: how unfortunate it is that whilst we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, that internal dissensions should be harrowing and tearing our vitals. It's a remarkable phrase, harrowing and tearing our vitals. This is how well it worked as a plea for peace between his 2 lieutenants. Jefferson wrote back of the illegitimate son of Nevis, Hamilton, I will not suffer the slanders of a man whose history, from the moment at which history can stoop to notice him, is a tissue of machinations against the liberty of the country, which has not only received him and given him bread, but heaped its honors upon his head. So that Dr. Phil moment was not hugely successful. Hamilton wrote back saying, Jefferson was an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics, and an anonymous letter writer from New York in those days wrote to Jefferson saying, I think you ought to get a damn kicking, you redheaded son of a bitch. So, as you watch the news today, and in all the coming days, just let your blood pressure come down a little bit. History can be a very effective antidepressant. Thanks very much. So questions? Yes, sir. The question is, give some sense of the condition of the Republic in Jefferson's presidential years. And was he really concerned after 12 years of Federalist rule that the Republic was in jeopardy? Is that a fair restatement? It's like a reading comprehension test. I think that Jefferson was driven, I argue in the book, that he saw implicitly or explicitly, more implicitly, he saw the period really of his entire public life up until 1815, 1816, as an unending struggle with Great Britain. We now know that there was a colonial period and an early republic period, and then the age of Jackson. That's very neat and tidy, but we have the privilege of carving it up that way because we weren't living then. So my argument is that really the 1790s and the partisanship, which I was just describing, and the ferocity of the partisanship that continued in Jefferson's time, where you had Federalists trying to secede from the Union after the Louisiana Purchase. One of the first reactions was Timothy Pickering up in Massachusetts drafting the first great articles of secession because they feared that power was going to move south and west. The best way I think of this is in terms of the Federalist reaction, the New England reaction to Louisiana is from a remark of my then 7-year-old, who my wife and I had a son and a daughter, and a third child is on the way. We find out she's going to be a girl, and my son comes to me and says, "Dada, we're going to be outnumbered, and I don't like our chances." And that's essentially what Timothy Pickering and John Quincy Adams were saying. That's Arthur Schlesinger used that too, I'm sure. But the struggle between really the French and Indian War at the end of 1763 and all the way through the end of the War of 1812, in my mind, that's a 50-year war. It's roughly akin, it's an imprecise analogy, but worth thinking about, the Cold War with the Soviet Union between 1946, 1945, late 45, and 1989. Remember, our struggle with the Soviet Union was sometimes hot, sometimes cold, sometimes very present in our domestic politics, sometimes less so. Sometimes it totally drove our foreign policy, sometimes less so, but it was always there. That's what I think the American relationship with Great Britain was like throughout those years. Jefferson did believe that the Republic was in perpetual danger from either a quasi-British influence that would lead to an American monarchy, a hereditary Senate, a president for life, which Alexander Hamilton had proposed at the Constitutional Convention. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was paranoid, but as Richard Nixon taught us, even paranoids have enemies. So it's an interesting argument. I think it's a convincing argument to make that Jefferson was right, that this was a threat, because the British did come back in 1812. So I think it's very difficult to argue that his fears were overly exaggerated. They may have been exaggerated, but they weren't crazy, because we did have to have a ratifying war. And so the republic over which he governed was one that felt as though it were on tenterhooks, that it was, in fact, the existence of the country was going to be, as Wellington would say of Waterloo, a close-run thing. And I think that that drove Jefferson and his era in ways that we don't fully appreciate because we won. But that happens with it. Same with the Soviet Union. So I think that it was a touch-and-go thing. Yes, sir. Back. What's next for me? I've done Churchill, Roosevelt, Jefferson, and Jackson. I'm doing George Herbert Walker Bush. And we've been talking about this for a long time. He wants it to be, as only he could put it, I say posthumous. He says, publish it after I'm paws up. So you can't really make this stuff up. There are a couple of, it's fascinating because he is such a great American life in so many ways. And he's 88, just got out of the hospital, spent 11 weeks there, but went to a Super Bowl party the day after he got out. So, when he went to a wheelchair about 2 years ago, I guess, 18 months ago, everyone was concerned about him. What they didn't know is that he kept running over his staff on the way out to cocktail parties. So he just got to move faster. So I'm doing that. As I've said to the president, it's hard to schedule if it's dependent on his death, which he appreciates, I think, at some level. When General Petraeus got in his trouble recently, you may remember, he had a inappropriate relationship with his biographer. I sent the president an email, and I said, "Dear Mr. President, I don't know if you've ever thought I was cute, but I don't think it's a good idea." And to his everlasting credit, he wrote back saying, "In your dreams, GB." So you can't make up high wasp humor. Yes. Compare and contrast Jefferson and Jackson, who came from the same political tradition, but were, to put it mildly, of different temperament. I think that's right. I realized in the middle of doing Jefferson that I should have saved Jackson for my retirement, because whenever he got mad, he just shot someone, and that's easier to dramatize. Andrew Jackson's life is like an episode of Bonanza meets Advise and Consent. That's essentially the way it is. So basically, Jefferson came from the very top of white society of his time. Jackson came from the bottom. Jefferson was very carefully and beautifully educated. By my count, Jackson never really spent an academic year studying. Jefferson believed in exercising power passively but effectively. Jackson adored exercising power overtly and actively. And yet, Jackson in many ways, I think, ratified and protected a Jeffersonian tradition, not only of a bias toward at least asking what the states' rights, what the smaller government solution was before you do what you want, but actually keeping that question on the table into the 1830s and even 1840s through Van Buren. He also pushed the idea of a strong and powerful presidency farther along than even Jefferson had. But Jefferson had put something in motion where, for us now, it's almost impossible to realize, you know this well, but remember, Article 1 of the Constitution is not the presidency, it's the Congress. So the president was really not expected to be as central a player as he became fairly rapidly. And so Jackson's contribution to a strong presidency and also continuing a Jeffersonian idea that a president should be a party leader, that you had to, the government depended on politics in a way that the framers at their best may not have wanted to admit. There's this sort of, actually George Bush is like this. The moment he became president, he said, well, the campaign against Dukakis, he said, that's history. Well, it is, but as we're seeing with President Obama right now, effective presidents are the ones who still have some base to mobilize on questions of governance, not simply questions of an election. Jefferson explicitly said that at its best, in a republic, men believe themselves participators in government, not at elections only, but every day. And it's an interesting word to use, participators. So he saw that. Jackson saw that. The main report we have on what Jefferson thought about Jackson. Jackson, remember, won the popular vote for president in 1824, did not get the requisite number of electoral votes. It went to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had a conversation. It was either a conversation or, as Jackson said, a corrupt bargain, depending on your point of view. John Quincy Adams becomes president. Jackson begins to come back to Tennessee, and he gets madder and madder as he gets closer. So by the time he got to Nashville, he was just foaming at the mouth about the injustice of this and began running in the way they ran immediately for 1828. In that period, Daniel Webster from New England went to Monticello and left a very damning diary entry about Jefferson, who had, when he was vice president from 1797 to 1801, Jackson had briefly been a senator, and Jackson would get exercised, I think is a good way to put it. So he would stand up in the Senate and get so upset that he would stammer and stutter. And Jefferson recalled this and said he was just a wild man. And he worried that Jackson would combine a kind of demagoguery with his military charisma and could become what was arguably the worst formulation, the scary formulation of that era, an American Bonaparte, which is something that Henry Clay said all the time, that Jackson was going to be an American Bonaparte. And so Jefferson left that. His daughters, after Jackson was president, tried to walk it back a little bit. I'm sure you all never do this, but politicians have a certain tendency, like pastors in a way, to take on the coloration of the person they're talking to. And so, not that we all say things to people we think they want to hear. I'm sure that never happens. But For Jefferson to be talking to Webster, a nationalist from New England, about Jackson, this remarkably new man from Tennessee, I suspect Jefferson was gilding the lily and telling Webster a little bit more than being more passionate in an anti-Jacksonian way because of who he was talking to. So. One more question. Yes, sir. Jefferson was an early supporter of the French Revolution. What was his opinion of how it turned out in the end? It may be too much to say that he was sort of heartbroken about it, but I think that gets somewhat to his very emotional, as you allude, his very emotional connection to it. He was there in 1789. He was there for the storming of the Bastille. He was there when Lafayette and others were drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It was a moment when even the Federalists in America believed that the French Revolution was intimately connected to the American Revolution, partly because the reason we won the war was because France had shown up. It was the last time France did anything particularly helpful for us. There's a, very quickly, there's a wonderful story about Churchill and Roosevelt at Casablanca in January of 1943 spend 2 weeks trying to get Charles de Gaulle to shake some other French politician's hand for some intimate, some complicated, intricate reason of French politics. And it goes on and on. They finally get it done. They go to Marrakesh to have dinner on the last night, their last night together. And one of the other guests at dinner says, well, how did things go with de Gaulle? And Churchill said, oh, don't speak of him. We call him Joan of Arc, and we're looking for some bishops to burn him. So some things never really change. Everyone believed that this was a natural progression from that a new world revolution for liberty was going to take place in the old. For Jefferson, who'd been there from 1785 to 1789, he believed this was part of the unfolding story, that absolutism was giving way. As things got more violent, as the terror came, Jefferson was very late to condemn or take a stronger stand against the excesses of the revolution. I think it's because he was there when everything seemed possible. And one thing, there's an argument in the Jefferson scholarship that he was overly pro-French and irrationally anti-British. I don't agree for the reasons we were talking about. He was anti-British, but it wasn't irrational, as it turned out. And I don't think there's an example anywhere in his statecraft where he did anything against American interest because of his fondness for the French. It was a tragic case for him because there was this sense, as Jefferson wrote, and we'll leave it here, as Jefferson wrote right after his inauguration in 1801, he wrote to Joseph Priestley saying that this whole chapter in the history of man is new. The sense that this was an era of immense possibility, and that what was happening what had happened in the United States was, as Jefferson put it, a great ball of liberty that was going to roll across the globe. That was a real sense of reality to them. And when it didn't happen, when the French Revolution ends not in a republic, but in an empire run by a dictator, that was yet another affirmation of Jefferson's fears about the United States. So even its cousin, if you will, the French Revolution, failed. It's another reason that I think Jefferson's anxiety about the American future were not crazy, were not unfounded, because even in France it didn't work. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, John. This is a wonderful contribution to the body of literature, but a wonderful contribution to our community today. This was a vision we had 5 or 6 years ago, and their philosophy, I don't know if the name tag was the same then, but we're here to get you there. And over the last 6 years, they've been here to get us there. And we've had noted authors like John, senators, mayors, CEOs, and a wonderful 6 years of contribution to this community. And the Bank of Nashville, during that 6 years, we've watched get local businesses there because they're here. So, and some of them are my clients, and I know personally that you've been there. So the contribution you've made to this event, Bill and Ann and Hunter and all the good folks at Bank of Nashville, thank you.